The stagecoach hadn't even rolled to a full stop when Ezekiel Talbot saw her, and something deep inside his chest cracked open like parched earth after a thunderstorm. She stepped down onto the dusty main street of Harlan Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1882, and she stood there with a single worn leather traveling case at her feet and nowhere to go, and every single soul in this town who had promised to be there was conspicuously, catastrophically absent. Ezekiel knew it before she did. He watched her eyes scan the crowd that had gathered out of sheer frontier nosiness, watched her search each unfamiliar face with a kind of desperate, controlled calm that told him she was experienced at hiding panic, and he saw the exact moment she understood. Nobody had come for her. He had been standing on that very boardwalk outside Hector Baines's general store since the first stagecoach had rolled into Harlan Creek 7 years ago, a self-appointed institution, part habit and part something he had never quite been able to name. The town thought it was eccentric. His brother Cord thought it was tragic. But every time that coach thundered in from the east, trailing its plume of red Nevada dust, Ezekiel Talbot was there. Today was different. Today the woman standing alone in the middle of the street, with the September wind pulling at the pins in her dark hair, was Sallie Reed, and she had not come to Harlan Creek by accident. He understood that immediately with the same bone-deep certainty that had kept him on this boardwalk for 7 consecutive years. She had come here expecting to be met, expecting a life that was supposed to begin the moment her boots touched this ground, and something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong before it even started. She squared her shoulders. That small motion, that quiet act of forced dignity in the middle of public abandonment, hit Ezekiel somewhere so far behind his ribs he had to look away for a moment just to breathe. He looked back. She was still standing there alone, her green eyes moving methodically now from the saloon to the dry goods store, to the sheriff's office to the livery, cataloging her options with the cool efficiency of a woman who had survived worse than this and was already calculating her next move. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with the kind of face that didn't announce itself as beautiful at first glance but revealed more the longer you looked, high cheekbones, a mouth that suggested both stubbornness and humor, and eyes that were doing the most extraordinary thing. They were refusing, absolutely refusing to show fear. Ezekiel stepped off the boardwalk. He had been standing on it in one way or another for 7 years. And now, because of a woman he had never met who was standing utterly alone in the middle of a street that didn't know her name, he stepped off it. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why it changed so completely, and why the stakes of what came next were so much higher than either of them could have known in that first unguarded moment of connection, you need to understand who Ezekiel Talbot was, and why he had been on that boardwalk since the first stage arrived, and what kind of darkness a man can carry for 7 years while standing in plain sight of an entire town. 7 years earlier, in the October of 1875, when Ezekiel was 29 years old, and the town of Harlan Creek was barely a collection of tents and ambitions clustered around a newly surveyed railroad depot, the first overland stage had arrived. And on it had been a woman named Clara Vane, dark-haired and laughing, who had been meant to become Ezekiel's wife. Clara had not stepped off that stage alone. She had stepped off it on the arm of a man named Douglas Fitch, a silver speculator from Sacramento who had apparently been far more persuasive during the 3-week journey west than Clara's written promises to Ezekiel had been binding. Ezekiel had been standing there with flowers he'd bought from a traveling merchant, actual flowers in Nevada in October, because that was the kind of man he was back then, the kind who believed that love deserved to be celebrated extravagantly and without apology. Douglas Fitch had given him a look that was equal parts pity and contempt. Clara had given him something worse, a look that suggested she had almost changed her mind at the last moment, but not quite enough. Ezekiel had stood on that boardwalk with his flowers until the stage was unloaded and the crowd dispersed and the Nevada stars came out, and then he had stood there a while longer. He had not cried. He had not raged. He had simply stood there until the shape of the loss became something he could hold without being crushed by it, and then he had gone home. He came back the next week when the stage arrived, and the week after, and the week after that. He told himself it was habit. He told himself it was because the stage brought the mail, and he was waiting for a letter of explanation from Clara, a letter that never came. He told himself a dozen different things over the years, and his brother Cord told him bluntly that he was punishing himself, using the weekly arrival of Hope Made Real as a kind of self-administered wound to keep himself from forgetting that trusting too deeply was dangerous. Ezekiel had never found a better explanation than Cord's, but he hadn't stopped coming either. He had built a life in those 7 years. He was not a broken man, not in the way that word sometimes implied. He owned a modest ranch 3 miles from Harlan Creek, ran a decent herd of cattle, had a reputation for being honest in his dealings and steady in a crisis, and was on civil terms with nearly everyone in town except Douglas Fitch, who had built a house here, which was a particular cruelty of geography. He was 36 now, with a lean, weathered face that had been seriously handsome once and had settled into something more interesting, a face that had been through things and had thoughts about them. He was also, if he was being honest with himself in the way that a man can only be honest at 3 in the morning, or on a boardwalk watching a stranger's loneliness, desperately, achingly lonely in a way he had grown so accustomed to that he had almost stopped recognizing it as loneliness and started thinking of it as simply his character. He crossed the street toward Sallie Reed. She saw him coming and did not step back, which told him something. She stood her ground with her traveling case at her feet and watched him approach with those green eyes that were still, impressively, refusing to display anything as vulnerable as hope. "Miss," he said, and took off his hat because whatever else the years had made him, they had not unmade his manners. "I don't believe anyone has welcomed you to Harlan Creek. My name is Ezekiel Talbot. I have a ranch outside of town. I'm not dangerous, though I recognize that's the sort of thing a dangerous man would also say." Something moved behind her eyes. It was not quite a smile, but it was the possibility of one. "Sallie Reed," she said. Her voice was low and even and carried a faint eastern cadence, Ohio perhaps, or Indiana. "I was meant to be met by a Mr. Franklin Holt. He wrote to me 8 weeks ago, and we had an arrangement." Ezekiel kept his expression perfectly neutral. He knew Franklin Holt. Most of Harlan Creek knew Franklin Holt, in the way that small western towns knew their least savory residents thoroughly and involuntarily. Franklin Holt was a land speculator who had been running a matrimonial advertisement in 3 eastern newspapers for the better part of a year, collecting correspondence and small fees from women he claimed were to compensate him for brokerage expenses. Last Thursday, Franklin Holt had boarded the westbound stage to California with what Ezekiel strongly suspected was a great deal of other people's money, and none of the good intentions he had advertised. He looked at Sallie Reed and understood in an instant what her situation actually was. She had traveled, based on her Eastern accent and the wear on her traveling case, likely 2 weeks, possibly longer. She had spent money she probably could not easily replace. She had arrived in a town where she knew nobody, had nowhere to stay, and had been comprehensively deceived by a man who had never intended to honor any part of the arrangement he had described to her in his letters. "Miss Reed," he said carefully, "when did Franklin Holt last write to you?" Her eyes sharpened. 6 weeks ago. He confirmed the date of my arrival and said he would be at the stage stop personally." A pause that was barely a pause. "You know him." "I know of him," Ezekiel said. "Tell me." He respected the directness. He told her plainly and without embellishment what he knew about Franklin Holt's departure from Harlan Creek 5 days ago. He watched her face as he spoke. She didn't flinch. She absorbed it with a stillness that was not the stillness of someone unaffected, but the stillness of someone who was processing damage and deciding in real time how much of it to show. When he finished, she looked down at her traveling case for exactly 3 seconds, and then she looked back up. "Is there a respectable boarding house in this town?" she asked. "Mrs. Elspeth Dre runs a clean boarding house 2 streets over," he said. "She's a fair woman. She'll give you a room for a reasonable price." "Thank you." She picked up her traveling case. "Miss Reed." He said it before he'd fully decided to. "Harlan Creek is not a bad town. What Holt did, that's not what this place is." She looked at him for a moment, and this time what moved behind her eyes was more complex, assessment and something that might have been the very early, very guarded beginning of gratitude. "You've been here a long time, Mr. Talbot. Since the first stage arrived," he said. Something about that landed differently than either of them expected. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then she nodded, picked up her case, and walked toward Mrs. Dre's boarding house with the same square-shouldered composure she'd had when she stepped off the coach. Ezekiel stood in the middle of the street and watched her go. He realized he was still holding his hat. Mrs. Elspeth Dre was a Nevada widow of formidable practical intelligence who had been running her boarding house since 1877 and had seen every variety of human circumstance arrive at her door. She took one look at Sallie Reed, listened to 40 seconds of explanation, and declared the situation a common Holt special, which apparently meant she had seen this before. She gave Sallie the room with the east window, brought her hot water and cold cornbread without being asked, and charged her a fair weekly rate that was lower than what she charged the traveling salesman. Sallie sat on the edge of the narrow bed in that east-facing room and allowed herself, privately and briefly, to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had left Coleraine, Ohio, with $62, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the sincere belief that she was going west to build a life with a man who had described himself in his letters as steady, God-fearing, and genuinely hopeful of a companionate marriage. She had been 25 years old, recently released from the obligation of caring for her ailing father who had died in July, and she had been, for the first time in years, actually free to make a choice about her own future. She had chosen wrong, or rather, she had trusted a man who had chosen to deceive her, which was not quite the same thing but felt identical from the inside. She put the silver hairbrush on the small dresser. She looked at her $62, now reduced by the train to Chicago, the stage from Denver, and 2 nights at a roadside way station to $31.40. She looked out the east window at the Nevada sky, turning the deep purple of a bruise at the edges. She was not beaten. She was furious, quietly and entirely, in the way that women who have been managing difficult circumstances for a long time get furious, without spectacle, without waste, like a banked fire that is in no danger of going out. She was also in a town she didn't know, with $31, no connections, and no particular plan. She thought about the man who had crossed the street to tell her the truth. Ezekiel Talbot, with his careful manners and his steady eyes and his inexplicably unhurried quality, as though he had nowhere more important to be than standing in a dusty Nevada street talking to a woman he'd never met. He had been there since the first stage arrived. She had heard something in his voice when he said that, something layered and old. She put her hairbrush parallel to the edge of the dresser, a small act of creating order in a disorderly situation, and began to think practically about what she was going to do next. The next morning, Sallie Reed was up before 6, dressed, and at the door of the sheriff's office before the deputy had finished his first cup of coffee. She filed a formal complaint against Franklin Holt, delivered with such calm specificity that the deputy, a young man named Archie Hollies who was clearly unaccustomed to defrauded mail-order brides who came prepared with copies of their correspondence, spent most of the interview trying to keep up with her. Ezekiel Talbot happened to be at the sheriff's office that morning for an entirely unrelated reason, involving a fence dispute with his neighbor Barton, and he arrived to find Sallie Reed arranging her stack of Franklin Holt's letters on Sheriff Clem Duval's desk with the precision of someone presenting a legal case. He stood in the doorway for a moment and felt something in his chest do the same thing it had done yesterday when she squared her shoulders in the street. "Mr. Talbot," she said, without looking up from the letters, apparently having registered his presence from the sound of his boots. "Miss Reed," he said, "I see you found the sheriff. I found the deputy." "The sheriff isn't in yet." She glanced up. "Is he reliable?" "Clem Duval. Yes, he's a fair man." "Good." She returned to organizing the letters. "Franklin Holt took fees from at least 3 women in Ohio that I'm aware of. I was the only one foolish enough to actually make the journey." "You weren't foolish," Ezekiel said. "You made a reasonable decision based on false information." She looked at him then properly with those green eyes that seemed to see things very directly. "That's a kind distinction, Mr. Talbot. It's an accurate one." There was a pause that held more conversation in it than most people managed with actual words. Then Clem Duval came in, shook the mud off his boots, took one look at the letters on his desk and said, "Is this a Holt situation?" And Sallie said, "Yes," and they were off. Ezekiel dealt with his fence dispute and left the sheriff's office, but he found himself, without particularly planning to, walking past Mrs. Dray's boarding house on his way back to where his horse was tied, which was not on the way to his horse at all. He acknowledged this to himself with the same blunt self-honesty he applied to everything. He was walking past Mrs. Dray's boarding house because Sallie Reed was staying there, and some part of him, the part that had been standing on the boardwalk for 7 years, had found something to look at. He told himself to be careful. He had been telling himself to be careful for 7 years. He told himself this time he might mean it. Over the following week, Sallie Reed made herself useful and indispensable to Harlan Creek with a speed that seemed effortless, but was in fact the product of 25 years of learning how to be competent in unfamiliar circumstances. She discovered that the school teacher, a consumptive young man named Mr. Wells, had been forced to his sickbed, and that the school's 22 children had been spending their days in various states of productive and unproductive chaos. Sallie had taught at the village school in Coleraine for 3 years before her father's illness required her full attention. She presented herself to the school board, which in Harlan Creek consisted primarily of Hector Baines and 2 ranchers' wives, and by Thursday afternoon she was teaching. She was good at it. Not in the soft, decorative way that some expected of women teachers in the West, but in the substantive, demanding way that made children actually learn things. She was patient with the slow ones and found ways to challenge the quick ones, and she was also, as the ranchers' wives noted approvingly, completely unrattled by the 2 older boys who had been terrorizing substitutes for weeks. Word got around. Word always got around in a town of 400 people. By the end of her first week, Harlan Creek had decided, collectively and somewhat proprietarily, that Sallie Reed was an asset. Ezekiel heard all of this through his brother Cord, who was married to one of the ranchers' wives, and therefore had intelligence that rivaled a Pinkerton operation in both volume and detail. He heard it and felt a complicated mixture of pride and protectiveness that he had no real right to feel about a woman he had spoken to twice. He went to the school on Friday afternoon, on the completely legitimate pretext of delivering a note to Cord's wife about a Sunday dinner arrangement, and found himself lingering at the fence while Sallie Reed sat on the school steps with a small girl named Mercy Baird who was crying about something. And Sallie was talking to her quietly, not trying to stop the crying but sitting with it, letting it run its course while providing a calm and steady presence beside it. Ezekiel watched this for longer than a note delivery warranted. When Mercy Baird went home and the last child had departed, Sallie looked up and saw him at the fence. She did not seem surprised. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "you have been standing at that fence for 20 minutes. 12, he said, "and I have a note for Mrs. Cord Talbot." Sallie stood up and brushed the dust from her skirt. "Is she expecting it today specifically?" "Not specifically," he admitted. There was that possibility of a smile again, moving just beneath the surface of her composed expression. "Then perhaps you had another reason for coming by." He came through the gate and handed her the note and then stood there, hat in hand again, with the afternoon light turning everything amber and unhurried. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in," he said. "That's an honest answer." "I appreciate honest answers," she said. "I've had a deficit of them recently." "The sheriff sent a wire to the California authorities about Holt," he said. "He wanted you to know." Something in her face settled slightly, some small degree of tension releasing. "Thank you for telling me." She paused. "Do you always make it your business to look after people the stage drops off without anyone to receive them?" The question was gentle, but it was not casual. He looked at her. "No," he said, "I don't." The word hung there in the Friday afternoon air, honest and slightly dangerous. "There's a church social on Sunday," he said, which was not what he'd been planning to say but was probably safer. "Mrs. Dre will be going. You'd be welcome." "I'd like that," Sallie said. He nodded, gave her the note for Cord's wife, and walked back to his horse, and this time he went straight to it. The church social was held on the flat ground behind the Harlan Creek Presbyterian Church, which had been built 2 years ago and was still the newest building in town. There were tables set up with food contributed by the various households: pine needle lemonade and dried apple cake, and actual roasted chicken from a ranch woman named Perla Vasquez, who cooked with a skill that made the whole territory feel civilized. And there was a fiddle player named Old Emmett, who was not particularly old, but had been called that since he was 12, and had made his peace with it. Sallie came with Mrs. Dre and was immediately absorbed into the social fabric of the town in a way that Ezekiel found himself watching with a quiet, almost proprietary satisfaction. She was good at people. She had the quality of genuine attention, the ability to make the person she was talking to feel as though they were saying something interesting even when they weren't, and she deployed it naturally, without calculation, which is the only way it works. Mrs. Cord Talbot, whose real name was Helen, declared her delightful within 5 minutes. 3 of the ranchers were already talking to her about their children's progress at school. The minister's wife was pressing dried apple cake on her. Ezekiel observed this from a moderate distance, because his natural social mode was one of quiet, comfortable marginality. He was not a man who needed the center of things. And when Sallie broke free from the minister's wife and found herself momentarily unattached, she looked across the social and found him immediately, the way eyes find the familiar when they've been tracking it. She came over. He handed her a glass of lemonade that he'd been holding without quite knowing he was going to hand it to her. "You've been watching me be welcome to your town," she said, taking the lemonade. "You've been welcoming yourself to it," he said. "I was just watching." Old Emmett started playing something slow and sentimental that was technically a hymn, but was being applied with considerable creative license. The late Sunday light made everything look like a painting of the West rather than the West itself, golden and improbable. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. Nobody asked Ezekiel Talbot about his ranch in a way that expected a real answer. They asked about acreage and herd size and water rights, which were the practical questions with practical answers. She said it the way someone says, "Tell me about something that is yours and that you care about." So he told her. He told her about the way the land sat in a shallow valley that caught the morning light and held it, about the small creek that his cattle used, and that occasionally had trout in it that he failed to catch, about the house he had built with his brother in the spring of 1876, when the lumber came in on the first freight wagon, and every man in the territory seemed to be building something. He told her about his dog, a brown hound named Sergeant who had an extravagant personality for his station in life, and about the kitchen garden he had attempted for 3 years with a stubbornness that had finally, this year, produced actual tomatoes. She laughed at the tomatoes. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was exactly what he might have predicted if he'd been thinking clearly enough to predict anything, low and genuine, and coming from a place of actual amusement rather than social performance. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "My mother had a kitchen garden. She grew everything. I used to sit in it in the mornings before it got hot." "What happened to your mother?" he asked, because the past tense was clear. "Fever, 1878. Then it was just my father and me until July. A pause. He was a good man. He was ill for a long time and I was his nurse for most of it, which is not a complaint, just a fact. When he died, I had the house, which I sold, and I had the question of what to do with the rest of my life. She looked into her lemonade. I answered an advertisement. And came 300 miles to be deceived, he said. And came 300 miles to be deceived, she agreed. Though I'm beginning to think the story might not end there. Their eyes met. The social continued around them, the fiddle and the laughter and the sound of children running, and they stood in it like two people who had found a still point in moving water. I hope it doesn't, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and there it was at last, a real smile, unguarded and without the composed management she usually applied to her face. It was brief, but it was real, and it changed things in the way that real things do, permanently and without asking permission. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. Sallie taught school. Ezekiel worked his ranch. They saw each other with the regularity that a small town creates whether you intend it or not, and they discovered that they were also, when given the opportunity, deliberately seeking out reasons to be in the same place at the same time. He brought tomatoes from his garden to Mrs. Dre's boarding house one morning, which was logistically unnecessary since Mrs. Dre grew her own vegetables, and Sallie was on the porch when he arrived and accepted the tomatoes with a gravity that exactly matched the scale of the gesture. He brought 3 tomatoes. She looked at them as if they were something thoughtful, which they were, and said she would have them with salt at supper. She brought him a book from the small lending library that Mrs. Wells, the consumptive schoolteacher's mother, ran from her front parlor. It was a natural history of the Western Territories with particular attention to the geology of Nevada, and she had picked it because he had mentioned once, in passing, that he wondered about the mountains to the east and what they were made of. He read half of it in one sitting and then was sorry he'd read so fast because he wanted more reason to talk to her about it. He asked her to walk with him on a Tuesday evening, which was a small and momentous thing. They walked the length of the main street and back, not touching, not needing to touch, talking about everything and nothing, with the ease of people who have discovered that they can be in conversation without the usual effortful performance of social connection. Sallie talked about Ohio with the dry affection of someone who had loved a place and left it voluntarily. Ezekiel talked about Nevada with the particular attachment of someone who had chosen to stay. She told him about her father's illness, about the years of nursing that had been simultaneously an act of love and a kind of quiet suffocation of her own life, the way she had watched her own future recede to the horizon while she administered medicine and kept accounts and read to a man who was dying more slowly than seemed kind. She told him this without self-pity, which made it land harder than self-pity would have. He told her, carefully and partially, about Clara Vane. He didn't tell her the whole of it, not yet. He told her there had been someone and that it had ended badly and that he had been more careful after that, perhaps too careful. Too careful how? She asked. Careful the way you get when you've confused caution with protection, he said. When you think that if you stay very still, nothing else can find you. She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him with the Nevada dark settling around them and the first stars appearing. And yet you kept going to meet the stage every week, she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too. They were in the middle of the main street with the lamplight from the saloon and the boarding house making pools of yellow light in the dust. Yes, he said. Why? She asked. It was not unkind. It was the kind of question that someone asks when they genuinely want to understand. He looked at the sky for a moment because sometimes the sky is easier to look at than the truth. I think, he said slowly, because stopping would have meant deciding that nothing was ever going to arrive, and I wasn't ready to decide that. Sallie looked at him steadily. And then I arrived, she said. And then you arrived, he said, with no one to meet you. Something passed between them that was too fragile and too new to be named yet. He offered her his arm. She took it. They finished the walk without saying anything more, and the silence was not empty. It was full of something that both of them recognized and neither of them rushed. But it was not simple. Nothing that mattered was ever simple, and Harlan Creek had its own ideas about how Sallie Reed's situation should be resolved, most of which did not include a quiet, patient courtship conducted on Tuesday evening walks. The problem arrived in the form of Douglas Fitch. Douglas Fitch had been in Harlan Creek since 1875, which was long enough to have accumulated money, property, and the particular social weight that money and property provide in a frontier town. He was 53 years old, silver-haired, outwardly charming in the practiced way of men who have made charm into a professional instrument, and he had noticed Sallie Reed the day she stepped off the stage with the same attention that he paid to anything that seemed valuable and unattached. He had also noticed the way Ezekiel Talbot had crossed the street to her. Douglas Fitch and Ezekiel Talbot had a history that both men had been navigating around for 7 years with the careful avoidance of two objects carrying the same magnetic charge. They did not fight. They did not speak unless forced to. They occupied the same small town with the mutual acknowledgement of a grudge that ran too deep and too old to be resolved by ordinary social means, and everyone in Harlan Creek understood this and arranged accordingly. Fitch called on Sallie Reed at Mrs. Dre's boarding house on a Wednesday afternoon. He was polished and correct in his manner, brought her a small box of lemon drops from Hector Baines's store, and proposed to take her driving in his buckboard to see the territory. He presented himself as a substantial man, a man of means and property, a man who could offer her immediate security and social standing in a town where she was still finding her footing. Mrs. Dre, who had been watching from the doorway with the full intelligence of a woman who knew everyone's history, later told Sallie about Clara Vane. She told her about the stage in 1875, about the flowers, about Ezekiel standing on the boardwalk after the crowd dispersed. She told her because she felt Sallie deserved to have accurate information before she made any decisions, and because she was, if pressed, on Ezekiel Talbot's side of this particular ledger. Sallie sat with this information for a long time. She did not entirely understand, yet, the depth of what she was walking into. She understood that Fitch had hurt Ezekiel by taking away a woman Ezekiel had cared for. She did not yet understand, because Ezekiel had not yet told her, that it was more specific and more painful than that. That Clara had written to Ezekiel from California, eventually, a single letter in 1877, and that the letter had contained a confession. Fitch had known about Ezekiel's arrangement with Clara and had deliberately targeted her during the journey west, motivated not by any particular feeling for Clara, but by a desire to establish dominance over Ezekiel in the new territory, where they were both going to be planting their respective flags. It had been, Clara wrote, a controlled cruelty, and she had been both its instrument and, eventually, its other victim, as Fitch proved to be as cold a husband as he had been a calculating rival. Clara was still in California. She had written only the one letter. Ezekiel had kept it. When Ezekiel heard that Fitch had called on Sallie, he heard it from his brother Cord, who had heard it from Helen, who had heard it from Mrs. Dre. The network of information in Harlan Creek was simultaneously its greatest asset and its most effective form of torture. He heard it and felt something he had not felt in years, not the old grief about Clara, which had long since transmuted into a kind of scar tissue, but something raw and present and much more dangerous, the specific, particular fear of losing something he hadn't even fully reached for yet. He rode into town the next morning and went directly to Sallie's classroom, arriving between the morning lessons and the midday recess. She looked up from the papers she was grading and read his face with the accuracy that she had, apparently, for reading the things people were carrying. "You've heard about Mr. Fitch calling," she said. "I have." He came into the classroom and stood in the aisle between the children's desks, holding his hat, which was apparently what he did when the situation called for being serious about something. "I need to tell you something I should have told you before, about him and about me." "Sit down, Mr. Talbot," she said. He sat in one of the children's chairs, which was slightly too small for him, which under other circumstances might have been funny. He told her about Clara. He told her all of it, including the letter, including Fitch's deliberate motive. He told it plainly, without drama but without omission, because she had said she valued honest answers and he intended to give her one that was actually complete. Sallie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to know who he is before you decide anything," Ezekiel said. "And because I should have told you sooner. I was being careful. I think I was being too careful." She looked at him. "He frightens you." "He doesn't frighten me," he said. "What frightens me is the idea that he might deceive you the way he deceived Clara, and that I might stand by and let it happen because I was too cautious to say the thing clearly." "And what is the thing clearly, Mr. Talbot?" He looked at her in the morning light of the small schoolroom, with the children's drawings on the walls and the alphabet chalked on the board and the September sun coming through the windows, and he said, "I would like to court you properly, Miss Reed, if that's something you'd consider." Sallie Reed looked at him for a long moment, with that steady green gaze that didn't miss much. "I turned down Mr. Fitch's driving invitation yesterday," she said. "I found it presumptuous." Something in his chest unlocked. "I also told Mrs. Dray," she continued, "that I appreciated her telling me about the stage in 1875. I told her I thought the man who brought flowers was probably more worth knowing than the man who stole them." Ezekiel sat in the small children's chair and did not trust himself to say anything for a moment. "So yes," Sallie said, and now the smile was there, the real one, unguarded. "I would consider it." The courtship was conducted with a combination of practicality and tenderness that suited both their natures exactly. Ezekiel was not a man who did things by half measures when he had decided to do them, and once he had decided, fully and without the reservations that had hedged him for 7 years, he was completely present in a way that Sallie found alternately wonderful and slightly overwhelming, not because it was too much, but because she had grown unaccustomed to being the full object of someone's careful attention. He took her to see the ranch on a Saturday morning, riding out on 2 horses he borrowed since she had mentioned she could ride, which she could, well enough that he revised his mild concern about the trail's roughness into straightforward appreciation as she handled the horse with calm competence. The ranch was what he had described: the shallow valley, the morning light, the small creek, the house that he and Cord had built. It was not a grand establishment. It was solid and clean, and clearly maintained by a man who respected the things he owned, without being consumed by them. Sergeant the Hound greeted Sallie with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting specifically for her, which Ezekiel found both gratifying and mildly embarrassing. She crouched to greet the dog with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had grown up with animals, and Sergeant essentially lost his mind with joy. "Traitor," Ezekiel told the dog. Sallie laughed and stood up. She looked at the house, at the kitchen garden with its final late-season tomatoes, at the valley catching the light, and he watched her looking at it and tried not to read too much into the expression on her face, though it looked like something that might have been recognition. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "The kitchen garden could be expanded," she said, looking at it with the evaluative eye of a woman who had grown up farming. "Along that south wall especially." "Yes," he said very carefully. "I'm just observing," she said. "I'm not presuming." "I know," he said. "I don't mind." That was the moment, though neither of them said so. The moment when the future shifted from theoretical to possible. The complication with Douglas Fitch did not resolve simply. He came to the school again on a Tuesday, this time without the lemon drops, and found Sallie alone after the children had gone. He spoke to her with the particular brand of condescension that wealthy frontier men sometimes employed when they thought they were being gracious, told her that she was making a poor choice in allowing Ezekiel Talbot to court her, that Talbot was a man of modest means and difficult temperament who would give her a small life in a small valley, and that he, Fitch, could offer her comfort and security and standing. Sallie let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Fitch, I appreciate that you believe you have something to offer me, but I find that what I value most in a man is honesty and the willingness to cross a street for someone who needs it. I have found both of those things. Good afternoon." Fitch left, but he was not a man who accepted dismissal gracefully. The following week, he began a campaign of subtle social pressure that was invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. A word here to one of the school board members that Miss Reed's situation made her appointment to the school somewhat irregular. A suggestion there that a woman who had come west on a matrimonial arrangement might not be the most stable influence on children. It was the kind of hidden motive and dark pressure that worked in small towns through accumulation rather than any single act. And Ezekiel saw it developing and felt a cold fury building behind his measured exterior. It was his brother Cord who brought him the news that the school board was going to meet on Friday to discuss Sallie's appointment, called by Hector Baines at Fitch's suggestion. Cord told him on Thursday afternoon. Ezekiel was at Sallie's room at Mrs. Dray's boarding house by 5 o'clock Thursday evening. She already knew. Of course she knew, because Mrs. Dray had her own intelligence network, and it was both faster and more reliable than Cord's. She was sitting at the small writing table in her room when he arrived, not writing anything, just sitting with her hands folded on the table and her face doing the careful, composed thing that he now recognized as her version of managing anger. "They won't take the school away from you," he said. "You can't guarantee that," she said. "No," he admitted, "but I can go to that meeting." She looked at him. Ezekiel. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It landed differently than he expected, which was with the force of something entirely real. "I don't want to be defended. I want to defend myself." He understood this. He had known she would say something like it. "Then I'll sit next to you while you do it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that would be acceptable. They went to the school board meeting Friday evening. It was held in Hector Baines's store after closing time, with 3 board members present. Baines himself, Mrs. Morrison, who ran the dry goods, and Cord's wife Helen, who was on the board as the rancher's representative and who had had Sallie's back since the church social. Fitch was not a board member but had apparently arranged to be present as a concerned citizen, which was the kind of arrangement that worked in small towns when someone had enough money and social credit to bend the rules. Sallie presented herself with her school records from Coleraine, a letter from the minister's wife about her character, and 3 weeks of her students' composition books showing measurable progress in their writing. She spoke to each concern that had been raised, specifically, without defensiveness, with the patient precision of a woman who had spent years nursing a difficult situation and knew exactly how to manage a room. Fitch sat in the corner and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. The case Sallie made was thorough and specific and completely undermined every vague concern he had tried to plant. Helen Talbot voted in Sallie's favor in approximately 10 seconds. Mrs. Morrison took slightly longer and then agreed. Hector Baines, who was a fair man underneath his susceptibility to Fitch's persuasions, looked at the composition books, looked at Sallie, and said, "Well, the children are clearly learning things." The appointment was confirmed. As they walked out into the night air afterward, Sallie looked at Ezekiel with an expression that was complicated and clear at the same time. "You didn't say a word in there," she said. "You didn't need me to," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you sat next to me." "Yes." They stood on the board sidewalk outside Hector Baines's store, and the night was cool and full of stars and the far-off sound of the saloon's piano, and Ezekiel Talbot looked at Sallie Reed and said, "I love you." He said it because he was 36 years old and had spent 7 years being carefully, productively insufficient, and he had learned the hard way that the cost of not saying the real thing was paid daily for years afterward. Sallie looked at him. A long, steady, reading his face look that he did not try to manage or explain. Then she said, "I believe you do." "That's not quite the same as saying it back," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause that was not unkind. "I have been deceived recently. I'm not being cautious to protect myself from you. I am being cautious because I want to be sure when I say it that I am saying it from a place of knowing and not a place of gratitude or circumstance." "That's fair," he said. "That's entirely fair. But I will say," she continued, with that composed expression and those honest eyes, "that I think about your ranch in the morning light more than is strictly objective." He smiled, and it was the open kind of smile that his face had been building toward for weeks. "I'll take that," he said. She smiled back, and they walked to Mrs. Dre's boarding house together in the Nevada dark, and when he said good night she held his hand for a moment at the door, just his hand, warm and brief and completely certain, and then she went inside. Douglas Fitch was not done. Men like Douglas Fitch were rarely done after one setback, because their relationship to the world was fundamentally premised on the belief that what they wanted they ought to have, and any situation that contradicted this was an error to be corrected rather than a signal to be read. He had lost Clara Vane to drink and distance. He had lost business investments to the silver crash of 1878. He had lost whatever social standing he once imagined he possessed by inches and bad decisions, and he covered all of it with the silver hair and the practiced charm and the continued presentation of himself as a man of consequence. What he did next was worse than the school board maneuvering because it was more direct. He went to the sheriff's office and told Clem Duval that he had information suggesting that Sallie Reed had left debts behind in Ohio that might make her presence in the territory legally complicated. This was a fabrication. It was a complete and deliberate fabrication, but it was the kind that required time to disprove, and time in a frontier town was socially costly. Clem Duval, who was a fair man as Ezekiel had said, took the information seriously enough to send a wire east for verification, which he was obligated to do. While the wire was pending, the social weather in Harlan Creek shifted slightly in the way that rumors shift things, not dramatically, not fatally, but in that ambient, uncomfortable way that made Sallie feel the ground under her feet had become slightly less certain. She told Ezekiel about it on a Sunday, sitting on the fence at his ranch, while Sargent investigated a ground squirrel with serious intent. She told him what Fitch had done, and then she told him very clearly what she needed. She needed him not to confront Fitch on her behalf, not to ride into town and make a scene about it, because that would make her the cause of a confrontation between two men with old grievances, and she was not willing to be that. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Wait with me," she said. "The truth will come back on the wire, it always does." "You're sure?" "I have no debts in Ohio," she said simply. "I'm sure." He waited with her. They waited 11 days, which were 11 days of Sallie teaching school with her characteristic calm, while Harlan Creek processed the ambient rumor and Fitch watched from his comfortable house. And Ezekiel went about his ranch work and visited Sallie every evening at Mrs. Dre's and sat on the porch with her after supper, talking about the day and the children and the state of the territory, entirely, visibly, and without apology on her side. On the 12th day, Clem Duval received his wire back from a colleague in Coleraine, Ohio. Sallie Reed had no debts, had left no obligations unmet, was remembered by her community as reliable and decent, and was apparently also missed by several former students who had sent along regards when the sheriff's wire was made known to them. Duval read the wire and walked to Fitch's house and told him, in the flat, factual voice of a man who has been made to do unnecessary work, that the information he had provided was false, that making a false report to a peace officer was a serious matter, and that he was going to be watching Mr. Fitch's conduct in this town very carefully going forward. Fitch said nothing. But he understood, finally, that he had reached the limit of what this town would accommodate from him on this particular subject. He was a man with practical self-preservation instincts, and those instincts told him that Clem Duval was not the sheriff who tolerated further pushback on a clear outcome. He stayed on his side of Harlan Creek's social geography after that. He did not speak to Sallie again, and he did not seek out Ezekiel's company, And eventually the town stopped watching for the next move and began to treat the whole episode as a piece of concluded history, which was the most useful thing they could have done. Sallie heard about Duval's visit to Fitch from Mrs. Dre and then went to find Ezekiel at the livery where he was picking up his horse after a blacksmith appointment. She found him there, leather reins in hand, and he looked at her face and saw something in it that was different from the composed patience of the preceding 12 days. "It's resolved," she said. "Duval told me," he said. "He's a fair man," she said, and there was relief in her voice that she allowed to be audible, that she didn't manage or contain. He put his horse's reins over the hitching post and turned to face her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered this with the honesty that she brought to everything. "I am now," she said. "Those 12 days were." She paused, choosing the right word. "Harder than I showed." "I know," he said. "I know they were." She looked at him. He looked at her. The livery was full of the smell of hay and horses and the ordinary afternoon, and it was there, standing on the sawdust floor with the October sun coming through the open doors, that Sallie Reed said, "I love you, Ezekiel." She said it simply and directly, the way she did everything. No ceremony or performance. Just the thing itself, offered cleanly and without conditions. He was quiet for exactly one breath. Then he said, "Thank you for waiting until you were sure." "I told you I would," she said. "You did." He reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, which was the first time he had touched her face, a small, careful gesture that carried the weight of everything they had not rushed. "You keep your word." "I try to," she said. "So do I," he said. "So do I." He asked her to marry him the following Sunday, October 29, 1882, on the porch of his ranch house at the edge of the shallow valley, with Sargent sitting between them with the proprietary air of a witness who had been waiting for exactly this development. He didn't have a ring yet because he had not been able to get to the jewelry box that the dry goods store kept for special orders without her knowing, so he gave her instead his mother's cameo brooch, which he had kept in the small cedar box on his dresser since his mother died in 1871, and told her the ring would come. "The brooch is perfect," she said. "It was my mother's," he said. "She was a woman who got things done." Sallie looked at the cameo in her palm and then pinned it to her collar with steady hands. "Then it suits the situation," she said. "Yes," he said. "It does." A pause. That wasn't an answer to the question. "Yes," she said, and looked up at him with the full, open face she showed him now, without the composure or the management, just Sallie Reed in the afternoon light saying yes. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ezekiel." He kissed her then, standing on the porch of the house he had built with his brother, with the valley spread out below them and the Nevada mountains to the east that were made. He now knew from the geology book she had given him, of Precambrian schist and Cretaceous granite, ancient and permanent, and entirely unconcerned with the small human history happening at their feet. The kiss was warm and certain and unhurried, the kind that two people share when they are not afraid of what comes after. They were married on December 10, 1882, in the Harlan Creek Presbyterian Church by the minister whose wife had pressed apple cake on Sallie at the church social. The town attended in nearly its entirety because Harlan Creek was a town that knew a good story when it was living inside one. Cord Talbot stood as Ezekiel's witness, and Helen Cord Talbot stood with Sallie, and Mrs. Dre sat in the front pew with a proprietary expression that suggested she was taking some credit for the outcome, which was not entirely unjust. Sallie wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she and Helen had made from fabric that came in on the November stage, and the cameo brooch at her collar. Ezekiel wore his one good suit, a navy broadcloth that Cord had made him brush 3 times that morning, and a look on his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely happy, the kind of happy that doesn't know what to do with itself and simply stands there. The ring was a slender gold band with a small garnet that Hector Baines's special order had produced 2 weeks before the wedding. Sallie wore it now alongside the brooch, and when Ezekiel put it on her finger during the ceremony she looked at it, and then at him with those green eyes. And every person in the church who was watching saw something completely private pass between them. The specific, irreducible acknowledgement of two people who have chosen each other without reservation. Old Emmett played at the celebration afterward. Not hymns this time, but waltzes and reels that filled the church hall with warmth and noise. Ezekiel danced with Sallie, which surprised several people who had not known he could dance, and they moved together with the ease of people who have learned to read each other. The way she followed his lead not with deference but with the collaborative attention of someone who was paying equal care to the shared thing. Douglas Fitch was not at the wedding. Nobody commented on his absence, and nobody missed him. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a Nevada winter that offered its usual variety of extremes. Bitter cold and sudden warmth and nights, so clear and star-thick, that the sky seemed to exist at a scale beyond comprehension. Sallie moved to the ranch after the wedding and discovered that life with Ezekiel Talbot in the shallow valley was exactly what she had allowed herself to hope it might be. Not easy in the material sense, because a small cattle ranch in Nevada territory in 1883 was not an easy life, but rich in the ways that mattered to her. She expanded the kitchen garden exactly as she had speculated to herself during the first visit, running it along the south wall in raised beds that she constructed with the methodical precision she brought to everything. She continued teaching school, riding the 3 miles into Harlan Creek 6 days a week on a gray mare that Ezekiel named Patience, and that Sallie thought was a slightly pointed name, though she liked the horse enormously. Ezekiel watched his wife settle into the ranch the way you watch something come into its proper shape, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been holding a space open for a long time without knowing exactly what it was for. She made the house more itself, not by changing its character but by inhabiting it fully: the kitchen garden, the books she added to the small shelf by the window, the way she sat at the table in the evening with the lamp pulling in close while she graded papers, and he worked through the ranch accounts beside her and Sargent slept between their chairs. It was ordinary life. Ordinary life was what they had both, in their different ways, been waiting for. In the spring of 1883, Sallie became pregnant with their first child. She discovered this in March, processed it with her characteristic economy of expression, and told Ezekiel at breakfast one morning by putting a small pair of infant-sized knitted booties on the table beside his coffee cup. She had apparently been knitting them in secret for 2 weeks, which seemed both highly practical and deeply Sallie. He looked at the booties for a moment, looked at her, and said, "Those are very small." "Yes," she said. "They'll be larger later." He stood up from the table and held her for a long time without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the holding didn't say better. The pregnancy made the winter recess from teaching permanent for a while. Sallie had intended to continue teaching through the spring, but a combination of her own body's preferences and Ezekiel's gentle, non-pressuring concern convinced her to rest more than she was naturally inclined to. She turned the classroom over to Mr. Wells, who had recovered sufficiently from his consumption to return part-time, and found ways to be useful at home that did not require riding 6 miles a day. She corresponded with the school board about curriculum improvements. She read extensively. She taught the wives of 2 of the neighboring ranches to read, which she had simply offered one afternoon, and which had turned out to be one of the more meaningful things she had done in Harlan Creek, because both women were in their 30s and had hidden their illiteracy with the practiced invisibility of people who have had to compensate for something for years. She taught them without ceremony or condescension, in the kitchen of the ranch on Tuesday afternoons, and within 6 months both women could read well enough to read to their children, which made Sallie quietly and completely happy. Ezekiel watched all of this and felt a consistent, steady astonishment at the woman he had married, not the flashy, public kind of astonishment, but the private, permanent kind that accumulates over months and years into the absolute bedrock of what love is. The summer of 1883 in Nevada was hot in the thorough, committed way that Nevada summers specialized in. The baby was due in November, and through the heat Sallie was characteristically matter-of-fact about her condition in public and privately. In the evenings when the heat finally let go, allowed herself to be held by Ezekiel on the porch while he told her about the things he was planning for the ranch in the coming years, expanding the herd, improving the fencing on the east pasture. And she would fall asleep against his shoulder before he finished, and he would sit there in the dark Nevada night with the weight of her against him, feeling something so large and uncomplicated that he could not have put language to it if someone had asked him. Cord and Helen came to dinner regularly through the summer. Cord Talbot was a simpler man than his brother in the ways that the word simple can mean generous. He was warm without calculation, funny without effort, and entirely devoted to Helen and their two daughters, and he had welcomed Sallie into the family with a straightforwardness that she found deeply refreshing after the politics of Harlan Creek's social landscape. Helen and Sallie had become genuinely close in the way of women who recognize each other as competent, which is a friendship that operates on complete mutual respect. At one of these summer dinners, sitting on the porch in the cooling evening, Cord said to Ezekiel with the directness of a younger brother who has been waiting several years to say something, "You know that thing you used to do, standing on the boardwalk every week when the stage came in?" "Yes," Ezekiel said. "Do you still do it?" "No," Ezekiel said. "Good," said Cord. "Helen always said you would know when to stop." Ezekiel looked at Sallie, who was talking to Helen and had heard none of this, and said, "She was right." "She usually is," said Cord. "It's convenient when it's about you and occasionally difficult when it's about me." November came in cold and bright, and on the 7th of November, 1883, Sallie gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by Mrs. Dray, who turned out to be an experienced midwife of impressive calm competence, and by the territory's physician, Dr. Calhoun, who had ridden out from Harlan Creek in the early morning dark. It was a hard labor of 12 hours, during which Ezekiel spent most of the time on the porch with Cord, who had ridden over at 3 in the morning when word came, and the two of them sat in the November cold and Cord talked steadily about everything and nothing to keep Ezekiel from the silence. When Dr. Calhoun opened the door and told him he had a son, and that Sallie was tired but well, Ezekiel walked inside and sat on the edge of the bed where Sallie lay with the baby wrapped against her chest, and he looked at the two of them together, this woman and this new person who was both of them and neither of them and entirely himself. And for the first and only time in Sallie's experience, Ezekiel Talbot had absolutely nothing composed to say. Sallie watched his face with those green eyes that missed nothing. "He has your ears," she said. "That's unfortunate for him," Ezekiel managed. "I like your ears," she said. He reached out and very carefully, very gently, put his hand over the baby's back, feeling the small, rapid breath of a new life doing its necessary work. "What should we call him?" he asked. They had discussed names at length over the previous months with no resolution because neither of them was willing to simply defer, which Ezekiel found wonderful rather than frustrating. Josephine had been tabled for a girl. For a boy they had circled several names without settling. "Thomas," Sallie said. "For my father." He had not expected that. He looked at her. "Thomas Talbot," he said, and heard his father-in-law's name carrying forward in a boy who had his own ears and would have, probably, Sallie's green eyes. "Thomas," she confirmed. "Thomas Ezekiel Talbot," he said, "if you're agreeable." She looked at the baby and then at him. "I'm agreeable," she said softly. Thomas Ezekiel Talbot was, from the beginning, a vigorous and opinionated person in a small body, a combination that Sallie had apparently been passing down from some deep reservoir of family precedent. He slept badly, ate enthusiastically, and had strong opinions about which blanket he wanted to be in, and who was allowed to hold him without prior approval. Ezekiel discovered that he was a natural father in the same way he had discovered he was a natural husband, by simply being fully present and not being afraid of the dailiness of it. He fed the baby in the night while Sallie slept. He carried Thomas in the crook of his arm through the ranch morning, while Sergeant walked alongside with the solemn air of an animal who has accepted a new responsibility. He talked to the baby about the cattle and the east pasture fencing, and the geology of the Nevada mountains, because Thomas seemed to prefer continuous calm speech to silence, and Ezekiel had found that the natural history of the territory was as good a topic as any for keeping the baby quiet and his own mind settled. Sallie returned to teaching in March of 1884, when Thomas was 4 months old and being managed during school hours by a rotation of Mrs. Dre, Helen, and a very competent 16-year-old girl named Bess, whose family ranched the next valley over. The school was glad to have her back. 2 new families had arrived in Harlan Creek over the winter and brought 6 children who needed educating, and Mr. Wells's health was again uncertain. Life in the valley settled into the shape that both Ezekiel and Sallie had been, without knowing it, building toward for years. Purposeful, warm, anchored in the specific pleasures of work that matters and people who are known. The ranch grew. The kitchen garden expanded again, this time with a bed of medicinal herbs that Sallie put in at the suggestion of Dr. Calhoun, who was trying to maintain a more consistent supply of basic remedies in the territory, without having to wait for the supply wagon from Sacramento. 2 new hands were hired for the cattle work, brothers named Reuben and Marco Reyes, who proved to be as good at the work as Ezekiel needed and as respectful of Sallie's authority in the household as she expected. Thomas grew with the speed that babies achieve when they seem to have decided that time is not something to waste, and by the following spring he was walking, or more precisely, executing a rapid toddling forward fall that he had enormous confidence in, and that caused his father to develop a reflexive bracing posture he would probably never fully lose. In the spring of 1885, they attended the funeral of Frank Wells, the school teacher, whose consumption had finally completed what it had started. It was a sad occasion but not a bitter one, because Wells had been a man who loved his work and had done it until he couldn't, and he had told Sallie the month before he died that knowing she would continue the school after him gave him a peace about it he hadn't expected to have. Sallie stood at the graveside with Thomas on her hip and Ezekiel's hand at the small of her back, and felt the weight of succession, the way lives hand things forward, and understood it as one of the fundamental dignities of a life lived for something beyond itself. She took over the school permanently and officially, with a salary that the school board had quietly increased since her arrival, and made several curriculum improvements she had been planning since her first week. The school board, all 3 members, approved everything she proposed. Hector Baines, who had been susceptible to Douglas Fitch's persuasions 3 years ago, had long since made his peace with Sallie Reed's presence in Harlan Creek, and his wife had become one of her Tuesday literacy students and was now reading novels of her own selection, which had changed something fundamental in Hector's household that he was grateful for without being entirely sure how to describe it. Douglas Fitch, for his part, left Harlan Creek in the late summer of 1885. The silver speculation that had sustained him through the territory's early boom years was increasingly thin, and the railroad politics that had made this corner of Nevada promising in 1875 had shifted enough that Harlan Creek was no longer the particular kind of opportunity Fitch required. He sold his house to a young couple from Colorado and departed on the westbound stage with 3 trunks and the compressed dignity of a man who considers his departure to be someone else's loss. Ezekiel was on the boardwalk outside Hector Baines's store when the stage pulled out. Old habit. He watched it go without particular feeling, the old wound long since fully healed into the scar tissue of history. Then he went into Hector's store to pick up the sugar and coffee that Sallie had asked him to bring home, and he went home. That evening, sitting on the porch after supper with Thomas asleep inside and the stars coming out over Nevada, he told Sallie about Fitch's departure. She was quiet for a moment. "Is it strange?" she asked. "With him gone?" "No," he said. "It feels like removing a piece of furniture that was always in the wrong place." He looked at the sky. "I thought it might feel like something resolved. It mostly just feels like nothing." "That's because the resolution happened a long time ago," she said. "Not today." He looked at her. "When?" She looked back at him with those green eyes, a little older now and absolutely no less direct. "When you crossed the street," she said simply. He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, and they sat in the warm Nevada evening with the sound of the distant cattle and the night insects and Thomas's small breathing from the window, and Harlan Creek's lights flickering 3 miles away, and everything that had been wrong in both their histories, the betrayal and the abandonment, and the years of self-imposed isolation, and the long Ohio years of nursing and confinement, and the $31.40, and the scheme of a dishonest man. All of it settled into the exact position it belonged in. Behind them, past, the accumulated raw material of the lives they were living now. In 1886, Sallie discovered she was pregnant again, and this time told Ezekiel during breakfast by placing a single wooden toy horse on the table beside his coffee, which made him laugh so suddenly he spilled his coffee, which had not been the intended effect but which Sallie felt was a perfectly adequate response. Thomas was 2.5 and deeply opinionated about the universe, and responded to the news of an incoming sibling with the philosophical flexibility of a person who has not yet decided how he feels about sharing fundamental resources. Ezekiel handled this with his characteristic steady patience, and Sallie handled it with the educational approach of a woman who understood children's developmental stages academically and practically both. The second baby arrived on a cold February morning in 1887, and was a girl this time, red-faced and loud, and absolutely certain about her own significance. They named her Eliza Jane, Jane for Sallie's mother and Eliza, because both of them had arrived at it independently from different starting points, which seemed like a sign neither of them was inclined to ignore. Thomas examined his sister with the focused intensity of a small scientist presented with a new specimen, and announced that she was very loud. Sallie agreed that she was, and told him this was probably a trait she had from her father's side, at which point Ezekiel gave his wife a look that she received with complete composure and a private smile. Harlan Creek in the late 1880s was changing in the way that western towns changed when the railroad's early promise settled into the steadier reality of agricultural and ranching community. Some of the more speculative enterprises had come and gone. Some of the families that had come for quick fortune had departed for California. But the solid core of the town, the ranchers and the shopkeepers and the families who had decided that this particular piece of Nevada was where they intended to make their lives, had grown more deeply rooted, and the community had the comfortable, settled quality of a place that knows what it is. Ezekiel's ranch was one of the modest successes of this settling. He had expanded the herd carefully, never beyond what the land and water could support, and had built a second barn with Cord's help in the spring of 1886. Reuben and Marco Reyes had become permanent ranch hands with their own small quarters behind the main barn, and their mother had come from California to live with them in 1887, a small, fierce woman named Rosa who spoke limited English, and had decided on her arrival that Sallie was entirely acceptable and Sargent was the finest dog in the territory. Sallie taught school until 1889, when the school board, finally appropriately funded by a new territorial education initiative, hired a second teacher to handle the younger children, which freed Sallie to focus on the older students who needed more advanced work before many of them departed for distant schools or took up adult responsibilities. She took this change in her role with the same practical grace she brought to everything, and used the reduced teaching hours to expand what had become known, somewhat grandly, as the Harlan Creek Library, which was really the collection of books she had been acquiring and cataloging and lending since 1884, operating now from a small room in the back of Mrs. Morrison's dry goods store that had been donated for the purpose. Thomas started school in 1889 and discovered, with the expression of someone who has received unexpected confirmation of a long-held theory, that he was good at reading and even better at mathematics, and that school was a place where these things were rewarded rather than merely tolerated. His mother's classroom was a separate matter entirely, conducted with a professional distance that both of them maintained with such perfect composure that his classmates were never entirely sure whether it was comfortable or strained, though Thomas himself understood clearly that it was simply the arrangement required by their respective roles, and was entirely fine. Eliza Jane was a different kind of child entirely from her serious, methodical brother. She was physical and bold, and had a quality of fearless engagement with the world that periodically gave both her parents significant cardiac events. At 3, she climbed the fence rail above what was safe. At 4, she convinced one of the Ray's horses to let her sit on it. At 5, she informed Thomas that she could run faster than him, and then demonstrated this convincingly enough that Thomas had nothing to say. Ezekiel watched his daughter with a combination of alarm and profound recognition. "She gets this from somewhere," he told Sallie one evening. "Does she?" said Sallie with the tranquility of someone who is not under examination. "The fearlessness," he said, "the absolute certainty." "I don't know what you're suggesting," she said, and turned a page of her book. He looked at her for a moment, at this woman he had known for 7 years now, who had arrived in his dusty Nevada town with nothing but a traveling case, and a competence that could have passed for serenity to anyone who didn't know the difference, and who had become as fundamental to his daily existence as the valley and the creek and the morning light. She was 32 years old and entirely herself, more so than when she arrived, the composed management she had worn in those first weeks having given way long since to the full and slightly formidable reality of Sallie Talbot in her own home and her own life, certain and curious and capable and his. "I was suggesting," he said, "that she gets the fearlessness from her mother." Sallie looked up from her book. "Of course she does," she said, as if this had always been obvious, and returned to reading. And he laughed quietly, the way a man laughs when he is completely, finally, irreversibly at home. In the fall of 1889, a new family arrived in Harlan Creek by stage, a man and his wife and 2 small children from Missouri, looking to homestead. The wife, a young woman of about 20 named Mabel Hurst, stepped off the stage and stood in the main street of Harlan Creek with the particular uncertain stillness of someone who has traveled far and arrived in the unknown, holding one child's hand and the other on her hip. Ezekiel Talbot was not on the boardwalk. He was 3 miles away at his ranch, repairing the east pasture fence with Marco rays, and thinking about nothing more complicated than the angle of the afternoon light, and whether the fence post was set deep enough. But Sallie Reed Talbot happened to be crossing the main street when the stage arrived, on her way from the library to the schoolhouse. She stopped. She looked at the young woman standing in the street with her children and her uncertain stillness. She crossed over. "Welcome to Harlan Creek," she said, and smiled at her, and the young woman looked up with the eyes of someone who has been holding panic just below the surface and has been given, unexpectedly, solid ground to put it down on. "My name is Sallie Talbot. Can I help you find your footing here?" Mabel Hurst looked at the woman in front of her, direct and warm and entirely certain, with a cameo brooch at her collar and green eyes that saw things without judgment, and said, "Yes, please. That would be wonderful." Sallie took the young woman to Mrs. Dray's boarding house, as someone had once done for her, and introduced her to Hector Baines and the school board and the minister's wife, and made sure she knew what the territory required and what it had to offer, and sent her husband a note to get himself to the sheriff's office to talk about homestead arrangements, because Clem Duval was a fair man and would set him straight on the land situation. When Ezekiel came in from the fence that evening, Sallie was putting supper on the table, and Thomas was doing his school arithmetic at the far end, and Eliza Jane was conducting some private drama involving her wooden doll and Sergeant, who bore his role in this drama with patient dignity. "A new family arrived today," Sallie said, setting down the bread. "I heard," he said, washing up at the basin. "From Cord. He said you met them at the stage." "Someone had to," she said simply. He dried his hands and looked at her back as she turned to the stove, this woman who had arrived with nothing and stayed to make everything, and felt the specific, daily gravity of loving someone completely, the way it pulls you steadily into the life you are living rather than away from it. "You crossed the street for them," he said. She turned from the stove with the pot of stew and looked at him with those green eyes, and in them was the 7 years of their shared history. The stage and the boardwalk and $31.40 and the school and the cameo brooch and Thomas and Eliza Jane and the kitchen garden and all the Tuesday evenings and the hard days and the Nevada stars. "Yes," she said. "Someone always should." He kissed her then, in the kitchen with the stew still hot and Thomas looking up from his arithmetic with the resigned expression of a 9-year-old encountering adult behavior, and Eliza Jane explaining to Sergeant that this happened, and he should not be concerned. It was a completely ordinary evening at the end of an ordinary day, in a house in a valley in Nevada in the autumn of 1889, with a man and a woman and their children and their dog, and the supper on the table and the sound of the creek outside the window and the mountains to the east made of Precambrian schist and ancient time. And it was everything that either of them, standing at various earlier points in their respective lives, might have understood as the particular and irreplaceable shape of a life that had come right. The stagecoach still came to Harlan Creek every week, still raised its plume of red Nevada dust on the eastern road, still brought the mail and the medicine and the occasional stranger who would become a neighbor. Ezekiel Talbot no longer stood on the boardwalk to receive it, not because he had given up on arrivals, but because the one that mattered had already come, and was sitting at his kitchen table with green eyes and a composed expression and a piece of bread in her hand, telling Thomas to put the arithmetic away before supper because supper was supper, and the arithmetic would still be there after. He sat down at the table. He was home,